Well, with Steve Jobs, you need to have obviously a great story, a great narrative, good content, but also style. There are a number of things that Steve Jobs does in terms of the way he effectively delivers a presentation. The very first thing you need to do is to maintain eye contact with your audience 98% of the time, and not talking over people's heads. Physically looking at people in the audience, picking out certain groups or certain individuals, and making very strong eye contact with them. Now, there are a couple of reasons why Steve Jobs can make great eye contact with people in his audience. The first reason is there are very few words on a Steve Jobs slide. Most of his slides are made up of images and photographs. So really, there are no words for him to turn around and read like most presenters do. Most presenters that will actually turn their back to the audience. They'll turn their back and read from the slides. Steve Jobs will never do that because there's a photograph behind him. But he also rehearses. He spends hours and hours over many days rehearsing keynote presentations. Every segment of the presentation, nothing is taken for granted. And he does that so that he has confidence in the material and that he can make eye contact with everybody in the audience. Every Steve Jobs presentation has a demonstration of a product, a brand new product, or even a feature within a product. He rarely gives the demonstration to facing the computer. He'll face the computer, bring up a page, and immediately turn back to the audience and explain what he's doing. The second thing is to remember to have open posture. Open posture simply means there's nothing in between you and the audience. So this, for example, would be closed. You never see that in a Steve Jobs presentation. Putting your hands in your pockets, having that slumping, slouching body posture, you never see that in a Steve Jobs presentation. There's no lectern in front of him. He will never speak from a lectern. He uses a wireless mic and he walks around the stage. So again, he's preventing any barrier in between himself and the audience. That's called having an open posture. The third way to deliver a presentation like Steve Jobs is to use effective hand gestures, and actually use hand gestures frequently. Steve Jobs uses a hand gesture to punctuate virtually every sentence. So if he's making an expansive gesture, let's say he's talking about a product category, and he says, this is a huge category, he'll make a big expansive gesture. Or, for example, when he was talking about a new computer chip that went into the MacBook Air, which made it such a small, thin design, he said, you should see this chip. It is the tiniest chip you've ever seen. So he always does hand gestures, but these hand gestures are not sort of stiff, formal, over-rehearsed hand gestures. So you'll never see, the steeple type of hand gesture from Steve Jobs. It's very natural. Now, if you really want to see the difference between an extraordinary speaker like Steve Jobs and a speaker who needs a bit of improvement, look no further than Macworld 2007. Steve Jobs was giving the presentation of his life. This was during the introduction of the iPhone, and he did what he usually does, which is to introduce a guest speaker. Well, this particular gentleman was the CEO of a very large company, but he did everything the exact opposite way that Steve Jobs did, at least when it comes to that nonverbal body language type of delivery. So this man literally walked out very, very slowly, hands in his pockets, and looked down pretty much the whole time. I don't think he was nervous, I just don't think he understood effective body language. And then he did what Steve Jobs would never do. He reached into his pocket and he pulled out an index card and he started reading from the index card. We are very happy to be partners here with Apple today. Well, it just brought the entire presentation to a halt. You could just feel the energy being sucked out of the room. And I was watching live blogging at the time. The bloggers were going crazy. They were saying very mean things, but things like, who is this guy? One person said, who's Mr. Note Card? Another person said, bring back Steve Jobs. They're usually not that critical with the guest speakers because the guest speakers are partners of Apple. But they were highly critical of this gentleman, and I believe it's only because his body language style was so different from the master, Steve Jobs.